what's your interpretation of the coctus Asclepius comment by Socrates, and how do you integrate that into everything else you said about that?
At the very end, he does make a comment about Crito. He asks for Crito to, just to summarize it, he asks Crito to dedicate a cock to Asclepius, seemingly for praying for the relief from life's woes. It's an interesting question, actually. I think that you could read it as his truly seeing it, very literally, as his truly seeing death as a boon and as a positive thing for him. And so praying for it and thanking the God of health for it. I think you could also read it as one last bit of convincing of his friends who were around him. I read the Phaedo as somewhat of a model of philosophy as therapy, as alleviating fears in order to cultivate virtues, as slaying this minotaur, or the fear of death, so that we can be virtuous beings. And on that model, I think that you could read it also as one last, perhaps heuristic, but one last gesture towards that end, allaying the fears of the people around him, namely his friends.
It reminded me a little bit, not that you guys say the same thing so much, but it seems of a paper by Sandra Peterson where she says the coctus Asclepius is expressing gratitude that he was able to experience a good death, and that involves the allaying of fears and not having people crying and distracting him from the task at hand and that sort of thing. It seemed like maybe it was a coherent way of thinking about that. Also, maybe it would also be coherent with the way you were. Although, again, for both of you, you both have seemed very focused on how he's helping everybody else get through his death, and she sees it all very much the other way around. She's getting them to allow him to have a good death, and then he's grateful for that. Not that he doesn't benefit them as well, but he's also focused on himself.
I think it's a really interesting reading, and I'm not familiar with the article, so I'm not sure. But I'm curious as to how successful he really is. I mean, does he really allay their fears, or does he gesture towards it? I mean, it seems as though the emotional outbursts are there. They're just kind of off stage. And I'm personally kind of fascinated with what seems to be happening off stage in the dialogues when Aristophanes gets the hiccups in the symposium. I think that's hilarious. And how can that, if you think about him going through these cures, where he's gargling water upside down and tickling his nose with a feather, while there's really ponderous speeches happening by the medical doctor, how can you not kind of think about how goofy this would look and how much of a comedic dimension this would add to the symposium? And here too, I mean, Apollodorus, I'm going to keep coming back to this, but Apollodorus is crying for the whole thing. And so it just seems to me that we can't ignore kind of what's backgrounded or what's framed on the outside and just focus on kind of the main stage somehow, if I can use all those metaphors. Because it seems like there is something happening beyond just what is here, and it's referred to, it's alluded to. And so if I kind of respond to you and to Rob at the same time, I think you could see Socrates as someone guilty of hubris. But I'm not sure that he doesn't make allowances for emotional outbursts, because he seems to make some allowances in letting Apollodorus stay, right? The wife has to go, but Apollodorus weeping in the corner, that's all right. And yet that seems to me like it would be much more distracting if you wanted to just get down to dialogue on the immortality of the soul with your friends, and something about that being pushed off to the background, and something about that passage that I think you refer to, Andre Cooper as well, where he's offered the hemlock, and he's described as looking up, and the word translates to bull-like. And so he has that kind of look of the Minotaur about him. He is the Minotaur somehow in that moment. I think there may be a chink in armor Socrates, and I'm really, really curious on finding that and interested in that because it does seem like he's unattainable. He's kind of out there. He's imperturbable.
Yeah, we should be able to.
I'd like to ask you a question about both papers since I could see them. Really, what I wanted to do was to try out interpretation of the way, basically a comparison, contrasting the two papers. I'd like to do that just by touching on the way, on the issue of fear and question of how each of you understand the role of fear in dialogues. So is fear ultimately something to be vanquished and hurt? Yes or no? That's sort of a framing question. And I guess the bigger issue that is connected to that for me is the relationship of emotion and reason. In a dialogue where the duality of opposites is explicitly at issue, it seems like that's a powerful duality that you guys are both working on. So what I wonder is this: are there two different models of what the relationship between emotion and reason, of how the relationship between emotion and reason should be understood, that are emerging from your papers? And are those two models at odds with each other a little bit? Right, so I guess I'm going to speak about the second paper first. It seems to me that if I'm getting this correctly, that the idea that you're putting forward, the idea of bounded rationality as it would apply to this issue, would say something like this. Reason can ultimately hurt itself up emotion.
Right.
It's not possible.
Right.
But so I guess the underlying logic there seems to be it would be better if it could. And so it's sort of a model which says we can't have what we're sort of practically unable to have the ideal thing.
Right.
So we're going to work with a qualified version of the ideal. So it's a model that preserves the ultimacy of the ideal and kind of qualifies it or something like that. So that's my question. Is that adequate? And here's my attempt to reconstruct what I think you're saying. And both of you guys can correct me if I'm wrong. So the second model that I hear is a model where the purging of emotion from reason is itself one of the paradigms that the dialogue itself is holding up for criticism, precisely by sort of setting up these dramatic details concerning, for example, in her expulsion and sort of subterranean freedom, such that those dramatic details are ultimately trying to destabilize the model that says it would be better if we could remove emotion and reason altogether. So that's sort of what I'm wondering if you guys are saying. Accurately understood what you're saying, and then I guess how you see your feelings in relation to each other.
Sure. As far as the first part is fear to be vanquished altogether, I want to say no. I don't think it's about getting rid of fear. I think it's about fear and more appropriate fears. I kind of want to throw on Aristotle to describe this. The right amount of fear somehow. I think it's the kind of fear that includes virtuous action, then there is a vanquishing of some sort of that type of fear. As far as the second part of the model of emotion and reason and whether or not they're at odds with each other, I think they are perfect agreements. And I think that the bulk of this seems to be, in my reading, that yes, these are at odds with each other for Pythagoreans, perhaps not for Socrates, but I'm not sure that we get so much of a positive model as we do a bracketing or a framing of what may be a negative or possible model, which is reason and emotion as being at odds with each other. So hopefully that answers your question.
I think those are really excellent questions. I think it's precisely because Samius and Kenneth are fearful that they're willing to be philosophical. And I think that they didn't have fear the dialogue, with having the motivation. So I think here and elsewhere, fear is extremely sort of motivated in a philosophical line. It's equivalent to philosophy as in one dress, fear as being part of the future of one. So my short answer is that fear is necessary for dialogue. I don't think Socrates is integrated in something that's overly into the philosophical line. But the right type of fear is so in the right way, in the right circumstances. And then the other question, I don't think in a dialogue, fear and reason, fear and emotion, emotion and reason are at odds. I think that on one hand, Socrates is saying, well, the ideal model would be for reason to be unto itself. But I think that what's really happening in the dialogue is, well, how can we appropriately navigate between reason and fear or emotions? And so ultimately, intermingle is a part of the philosophical life, at least what Socrates is trying to adopt as a philosophical life. Having appropriate fear is called
well, yeah, earlier I was following up on the exchange with, I guess, Sonia primarily, and now it seems to also to discuss the passage in the middle of the almost the very section where Phaedo is remembering how Socrates replied to the objections that Samius said in this way. And he says, jumps back into the framing dialogue with the shepherd team. Boy, I always admired Socrates, especially at that very moment, because he was always sensitive about how his arguments were received by us and what kind of effect they had. You seem to support generally the overall reading of what Socrates is trying to do. And specifically, he says, and so we leaned over and played with my hair and talked about how I probably cut my hair in the morning and warned me in some fashion that I don't remember talking. But I wonder if you think that that passage, which is brief, emphatically central, the drama of dialogue, not an argument, but maybe also the is not only about emotion, but also somehow about something specifically feminine, because that was part of the concept.
I'm not sure how to answer whether or not it's specifically feminine. I think it's specifically physical. And I think one thing that's really remarkable about the Phaedo is how much we hear about what Socrates' body is doing at any given moment. He's touching hair, he's petting Phaedo essentially, or he's planting his feet firmly on the ground and leaves the feet there for the rest of it. And he's doing these various physical, and so there seems to be a reference to the physical, which repeats itself. And I find that really odd in a dialogue that seems to be a denigration of the physical and a prayer for the release from the physical, if it really is that.
So how important was it to you reading that the parts that are more bodily and more emotional are also somehow affected?
On the one hand, I kind of want to avoid that, there is, I guess I kind of like back up, say maybe something about the framing, showing what's excluded and showing what is not going to enter into this discussion that gets sacrificed for this discussion. And in that regard, these different, and I'm not sure how you would respond to this, but in a way the bounded rationality, which I'm very much not comfortable with. But I can refer to it. And the limits of what is not included are recognized in the piece of the Does that?
Yeah, well, I find it very interesting. So on the one hand, you think there is a specific association with female things, and also that this is a way of recognizing it, choosing to recognize, meaning doing so somewhat emphatically, but also in a negative way, and then somehow it also calls into question or sheds a new light on it, let's say, the parts that are chosen, which are traditionally associated with music and also.
The passage that's most emphatic in my paper on that is largely a quote from Caballero,
From?
who makes Adriana Caballero, who really makes that split more gender. And I think there's a lot of validity to that. I think I would step away from making it quite as gendered as she does, but I think it's a very interesting read that pairs these things with one another.
Time for one more question.
Just one comment. I think both of you are right in thinking that Saki is not trying to purge, advocate with purge just any emotion that they have. Now, there's at least one textual passage that is in the protagonist, which suggests that Saki thinks that at least some fear is good, because at least that when it encourages person fear, his fear is not shameful. Right? Now, of course, if you think that some fear is good, if Saki thinks that some fear is good, or some emotion is good, then how do we differentiate good emotion from bad emotion? Doesn't have to be any reason. So if that's right, then it just look like, reason has to be completely separate emotion. That is something.
Practical reason.
Right.
Yeah, is that a question? So,
But you want to really qualify it as practical reasons.
well, I mean, I was being a little flip, but that's a good question. I mean, I do think you have to distinguish. But I think even in your question, you would accept that reason is a part of emotion.
Why can't it just be theoretical reason?
Why can't what?
The theoretical reason rather than practical reason. Because presumably, why some emotion is good or appropriate, because it is good for you to have it. So we need reason to pick it up.
I agree.
Just theoretical reason to pick it up.
I agree. So would you maintain that would be a position? I think nicely with Phaedo, talking to Silas and Kevin. Because there it seems to be more practical reason that's an issue. At least in that discussion of the soul of the body. I'm asking, but to me that seems to be, practical reason seems to be more of an issue there. Even in the passages that I've cited, it's for basis, it's practical. But I could be wrong. I mean, I'm just saying that it seems there it's practical.
Well, let's thank our panelists. We have a luncheon catered for us over in the philosophy department, so we're going to head back over to the Plaza building for that, and then maybe at 1 for another. Okay, well, welcome to the second panel of the day, our conference on Phaedo. We will begin with a paper from Glenn Rawson which is at Rhode Island College. The title of his paper today is Innate Logoi in Plato's Phaedo and its Predecessors. So please join me in welcoming Professor Rawson. Plato is widely considered the founder of epistemological nativism. Nativism, the view that much of human knowledge requires highly specialized, innate mental resources, including what would later be called innate ideas. Yet Plato's important achievement on this issue is also, I think, seriously misunderstood. We underestimate his nativism as a singularly naive beginner's approach, even as we overestimate its originality by ignoring nativist trends among his predecessors. It is, of course, Platonic recollection, the model of learning as a special kind of remembering, especially in the Meno and the Phaedo, that wins Plato first mention in our histories of innate ideas. It also distinguishes Plato as the one stellar author of a naively non-dispositional model of innate ideas. Non-dispositional in the sense of ascribing the innate possession of the actual content of the knowledge to be learned, rather than some specialized innate disposition to produce that content when stimulated by appropriate experiences. Or so it seems. I have argued elsewhere that in fact Plato generally expresses his nativism with dispositional models like a mental pregnancy, or an intellectual vision, or even a spiritual hunger. Although each of these coordinate models appears repeatedly in the same set of middle period dialogues, and each of them is presented with basically the same kind of qualified attitude that attends the model of recollection, all of them are overshadowed because recollection looms so large in our readings of Plato's middle dialogues. Here I examine how the Phaedo introduces innate knowledge in terms of innate actual logos, the Greek word logos, plural logos, yet then fails to demonstrate or even pursue that extravagant introduction. Then I compare some neglected nativist trends in Plato's predecessors, finding, I think, the first theory of innate logoi in the fragments of Heraclitus. The notion that genuine learning is a special kind of recollection is discussed in the Phaedo rather differently from the Meno, but only after a specific reminder of that discussion in the Meno. Here's that passage quote. Yes, replied Cebes. And then there's that other argument you're used to telling too, that our learning is really nothing but recollection. According to that argument, if it's true, we must have learned what we now remember in some previous time. And this is impossible unless our soul exists before it comes into human form. So in this way too, the soul seems to be something immortal. But then Simmias responded, but Cebes, what are the proofs of that? Remind me, I don't remember it very well at present. One very fine argument, said Cebes, is that when people are questioned, if one questions them well, they themselves tell everything as it is. And they wouldn't be able to do that unless the knowledge and the correct explanation were really in them. Moreover, if one leads them to diagrams or something else like that, that will show very clearly that this is so. It's as if Cebes has been reading the Meno and remembers especially the geometry lesson, together with Socrates' superficial insistence that he's only asking questions. Cebes even accommodates here the fact that the geometry lesson there stimulated only true beliefs rather than full knowledge. Together with the point near the end of the Meno that
true beliefs become knowledge through being able to give the explanation. So Keve says here that in Phaedo that what's innate is not just correct beliefs, but knowledge and correct explanations innate. Yet Socrates immediately leads the discussion in a different direction. Simmias says, I want to experience this very thing that our discussion is about, recollection. Socrates does not then lead him through a geometrical diagram, nor does he insist on just asking questions, but instead he conducts a less formal demonstration of the innateness of the basic general concept of equality. In the first stage of the argument, he argues that the content of this idea cannot be provided by experience in this life, because it's already presupposed by any judgment that we make of the imperfect equality of physical things. Then, in the second stage of the argument, he argues that knowledge must have been known before birth, forgotten at birth, and remembered when we judge the imperfect equality of physical things. Of course, what we recollect according to this argument is not a memory of having learned, or a memory of having known it in a previous life. In effect, what the first stage of the argument gets at is a condition for first using and later recognizing a kind of knowledge whose content could not have been provided by the content of experience in this life. Rather, the content of our experience stimulates the production of that concept. Socrates reminds us of it. Many cognitive scientists today still believe that some important kinds of innate knowledge are successfully revealed with this kind of argument, which is called the argument from the poverty of the stimulus. Now, the second stage of the recollection argument, which draws that conclusion of conscious prenatal knowing things, is not nearly so successful. What I wish to emphasize about it here is Socrates' own emphasis upon the alleged forgetting at birth, because of its consequence for Keves' initial suggestion that we have innate knowledge and innate logic, innate explanations. When Simmias agrees that the knowledge is somehow possessed before birth, Socrates asks, which do you choose, Simmias? That we are born already knowing, or that we later recollect things of which we previously had knowledge? Simmias is unable to choose until Socrates reminds him that actual knowing requires being able to give an account, give a logos, an explanation, an account of the thing that we claim to know. And Simmias laments that most people cannot do so about things like perfect equality or beauty or goodness, the things they're talking about in freedom. They now conclude that people do not have the relevant knowledge continuously in them because they do not always have the relevant logoi available and ready to give. Plato hereby rejects precisely the extravagant version of innate knowledge that's initially suggested by Keves. That we couldn't produce knowledge by ourselves unless we already have really in us the knowledge and correct the logoi about all things. Now, Socrates does not go on to explain what sort of trace or effect that lost knowledge would have to have in order to make reproducing it possible. But he does insist that it's lost and that its reproduction requires stimulation by sense perception. So in spite of the initial statement of the theory of recollection by Keves, the model of learning as recollection as it's explained in the Phaedo is incompatible with the continuous possession of actual logoi in the mind. This somewhat dialectical and circuitous path of proposing an extravagant version of the theory and then providing an illustration and revising the initial proposal was already followed in that earlier dialogue, the Meno. There it was Socrates who first proposed the extravagant notion that we have already learned all things in a long series of previous lives. The But then the geometry lesson demonstrates something different, that even an uneducated slave already possesses, at least implicitly, the true beliefs that are required to deduce the answers to subtle geometrical problems by way of producing the correct explanations. Those basic true beliefs are implicit in our concepts of things like perfectly straight lines and squares and doubles, which are innate, as an argument like the one from Phaedo would conclude. Then after the geometry lesson, Socrates revises his statement about recollection, so that it's not really about learning in previous lives, but about, quote, being always in a state of having learned these things. In other words, about innate knowledge of some point. Furthermore, although Socrates first suggests that the slave already has the actual knowledge in him, and then suggests instead that he doesn't have the actual knowledge, but he has instead true beliefs that can be converted to the knowledge. Finally, the whole dialogue ends with the conclusion that neither knowledge nor true beliefs are innate, named explicitly at 97. This other dialogue, the symposium, which may well have been composed in between the Meno and the Phaedo, repeats this conclusion that neither knowledge nor beliefs are continuous possessions of the human mind. Neither knowledge nor true beliefs are continuous possessions of the human mind, even though that dialogue also concludes that all human minds are somehow pregnant with the seeds of knowledge and the seeds of correct logoi. The mental pregnancy that Diotima describes there contains successive conceptions and deliveries of increasingly adequate logoi, until finally, ideally, the only fully true logos of a transcendent form is produced. The increasingly adequate logoi are stimulated by experiences of increasingly abstract beauty. So the mental embryos with which the learner begins in that moment are far from complete actual logoi. And we've just seen the corresponding conclusion of the Phaedo. So Platonic recollection, as Plato explains, does not include innate actual beliefs or innate actual knowledge or true innate actual logoi. So the alleged founder of our long tradition of innate knowledge did not, after all, subscribe to the naively non-dispositional understanding of innate ideas. Or can we find anyone who did? It isn't exactly easy. Histories of innate ideas do not discuss philosophers before Plato, and studies of philosophy before Plato do not discuss precursors to his models of innate ideas. But in fact, the beginnings of epistemological nativism arise within the general trends of pre-Socratic naturalism. Or so I want to argue. Among the pre-Socratic displacements of supernatural interventions with regular natural causes and the recognition of a rationally ordered nature, some philosophers began to conceive of a human mind whose own special nature is to know the natural world by virtue of elements that it shares with that natural world. It's in this way that early Greek naturalism introduces, along with the celebrated beginnings of empirical research, also the unsung origins of the nativist approach to epistemology. Now, at first sight, the most obvious candidate for a precursor to Platonic recollection is Pythagoras. According to the Pythagorean tradition, Pythagoras himself claimed to have been reincarnated many times and to have retained memories intact from former lives. In a way, this looks like the naively non-dispositional version of fully formed inborn knowledge. He was already born with these memories, already born knowledge of these things about the world. This looks like the naively non-dispositional version of fully formed inborn knowledge that's often loosely ascribed to Plato. However, Pythagoras' special claims about his own personal history need not imply any general theory of knowledge or of universal human capacities. Rather, I think they probably indicate a kind of common sense model of learning through experience that has just been stretched out over many lives. In any case, this early notion of an immortal, reincarnated mind gives no indication that the content of any knowledge is already prefigured in the mind's own natural resources. So not Pythagoras. Empedocles followed Pythagoras' lead in claiming to retain personal memories from experiences in previous lives. But he also proposed a general explanation of knowledge that was a more philosophical advance toward a theory of innate ideas. According to Empedocles, the human mind contains the same four elements or roots that in various proportions comprise the whole natural world: earth, air, fire, and water. And according to Empedocles, that is why the mind can know all things, because it has in it the same basic elements as anything that it would know. According to a principle that only light knows light. Light knows light. It takes a similar thing to know a similar thing. So in a way, the content of all knowledge to be learned is prefigured in the contents of the mind before learning. That's for Empedocles. However, this theory of innate materials for knowledge has no clear implications for innate beliefs or innate concepts, or even for specialized natural dispositions to produce particular beliefs or concepts. So I think Empedocles is getting the process started, but he doesn't really have that notion of innate ideas or innate knowledge. Now, Aristotle interpreted other philosophers as, in effect, starting that light knows light kind of explanation of knowledge before Empedocles did. He discusses that sort of thing selectively in the Animal Book 1. Among those earlier philosophers is Heraclitus. And Heraclitus proves to be the man we're looking for, I think. It's not just that Heraclitus privileged one of Empedocles' elements, fire, in the constitution of both the mind and the world he knows. And it's not even that he described both the world and the mind as sharing the same ordered transformations of elements. More broadly, Heraclitus may be thought the first promising candidate for founder of the nativist tradition, because he's the first who clearly ascribes epistemic functions to a mind or soul of psyche, instead of a body or some part of the body. And because he's our first clear witness to philosophical uses of the terms logos and phusis. Logos can be anything said, it can also be rational explanations, it can also mean even the faculty of reason, so the rational explanation that is produced, or the faculty of reasoning that produces it. Logos can be anything. Phusis has roughly the same range of meanings as our term nature. So Heraclitus is the first to have clear philosophical uses for logos and phusis, the first to ascribe knowledge to the psyche, the mind or soul, instead of some body. Such special attention to mind and reason and nature would seem to be necessary groundwork for an incipient view of innate ideas. And in this, I think, we're not disappointed. We shall see that Heraclitus, but in his own riddling way, proclaims the existence of a great logos that is the content of real wisdom, and that is also always present in the human mind as well as throughout the universe. So I want to focus on comparing the remaining fragments of Heraclitus with what I've said about Plato's Phaedo. It's long been recognized that two of Plato's arguments in the Phaedo are reminiscent, at least, of Heraclitus, namely the arguments concerning cycles of opposites, and mutual exclusion of opposites. But otherwise, little is made of connections with Heraclitus in the standard philological and philosophical commentaries on the Phaedo. Much more is made of a Pythagorean background to the basic theme of immortality, and a particular theme of reincarnation. The Pythagorean connection is also detected dramatically in the framing conversation with Echecrates, who is a Pythagorean at Phaedo, where that conversation takes place. And also detected dramatically in the mention of Simmias and Cebes having spent time with Philolaus, who was a famous later Pythagorean. Now, C.J. Rowe, in the latest philological commentary on the Phaedo, warns us that Plato qualifies these dramatic connections to Pythagoreanism by the fact that both Simmias and Echecrates, both a character in the dialogue and a character in the framing conversation, have previously been persuaded by the theory that the soul is a kind of harmony of bodily elements, which is incompatible with Pythagorean reincarnation, which is what the dialogue says. In this connection, we should recognize that Heraclitus too maintained some version of the immortality of the soul. And he emphasized the superiority of unapparent harmonies. And one of his examples was the backstretched or back-turning harmony in the music-producing tension of stringed instruments like the lyre, which is exactly the example that Simmias uses to illustrate the view that the soul is a harmony in our dialogue with Phaedo. So it may be better, instead of speaking of a general Pythagorean background to the Phaedo, to imagine a Pythagorean foreground in the Phaedo with a Heraclitean background, or perhaps a Heraclitean underground, because a persistent current of variations on Heraclitus flows all through the Phaedo. So before I finish with what I consider the most important connection between Plato and Heraclitus on the subject of innate logoi, I'll try to prepare by attempting a quick review of what I'm calling this Heraclitean underground in dialogue. For one thing, Heraclitus' great discovery about the traditional opposites, namely that their mutual exclusion is not something incidental, but indicates a deeper connection between them, not just a physical, but a conceptual connection, is introduced to the discussion already in Socrates' first words in the Phaedo. He says, "What a strange thing what men call pleasure seems to be, and how astonishing the relation that it has with what's thought to be its opposite, namely pain. A man cannot have both at the same time, yet if he pursues and catches the one, he's almost always bound to catch the other also, like two creatures with one head." This sort of example concerned Heraclitus too. He famously said that disease is what makes health pleasant. Disease is what makes health pleasant and good, as hunger does fullness and weariness rest. In the Phaedo, this kind of example prefigures the later argument that extrapolates from the sleeping and the waking to a similar connection between the living and the dead. And that argument in turn pursues Heraclitus' claim that mortals are immortal, immortals mortal, these living in death, those are the dead who their life. So that's one deep point of connection between the Phaedo and Heraclitus. Second, soon the central task of the dialogue is identified as Socrates' defense of his willingness to die. He quickly expresses his confidence in a better afterlife for good men. Then he explains his practice for dying in terms of avoiding the physical pleasures and passions that keep the soul in its bodily prison, and seeking a pure knowledge proper to the soul in separation from the body. Probably the earlier speakers from today are not going to let me get away with that one. Contrary to popular exchanges of pleasures for pleasures and fears for fears, he says real virtue requires exchanging everything else for wisdom. So what's the connection with Heraclitus? Every point in this opening defense recalls Heraclitus' particular brand of anti-hedonistic philosophy. Heraclitus said that greater deaths win greater destinies. He said that what passion wishes, it buys at the cost of soul, as if it would keep imprisoning that soul more and more in the body. That's what Socrates says. That sound thinking is the greatest virtue, and that all things are an exchange for fire, and the fire of soul is the wise one. So all of the points that Socrates makes in his initial statement of defense recall certain themes in Heraclitus' fragment. Third point, later arguments then explain the divinity and immortality of the soul by way of exhaustive contrast with the characteristics of all physical things. Above all, their constant generation, their change and destruction. This is Plato's widely recognized accommodation of Heraclitus' notion that everything flows in the whole physical world as in a river or a fire. Panto Rei, the most famous thing in Heraclitus' alleged is that everything flows. And Plato seems to be alluding to precisely that point at least 2 points, 9 B to C and 111 to B. And in this connection, Socrates at one point claims that the existence of an eternal soul stands or falls with the existence of the eternal forms that transcend physical space and time. Now, similarly, one of the most important things Heraclitus did, he proclaimed an eternal logos that transcends the changing physical world, and he located it also in the soul. Fourth point, the arguments for the absolute separation of the soul from the physical world, which requires that it be like the transcendent forms, are surrounded by stories and images of the soul being covered, weighed down, even infected by bodily elements, from which it must be purified. Now there's a tension, right? We're talking about a soul that's of an entirely different nature from the body, but also that the body infects it, bears it down, keeps it tied to the earth. This tension between the notions of a genuinely eternal, non-physical soul and a soul that can be more or less physical repeats a tension among Heraclitus' friends, which make their claims about immortal mortals in the context of a physical explanation of everything, including the destruction of souls. They get destroyed by getting too wet, he says, or is alleged to have said. Now, Plato's idea that philosophy purifies the soul, making it less corporeal in preparation for death, seems to repeat in a somewhat more abstract way Heraclitus' idea that the soul can be more fiery or more moist, and that fieriness in it is what makes it wiser and more immortal. Early in the dialogue, the Phaedo, this purification of the soul is identified by Socrates as something very important, but especially difficult to understand. He even calls it a kind of riddle handed down from olden times. He says, there is the story or account that is put in the language of the mysteries that we men are in a kind of prison, and that one must not free oneself or run away. That seems to me an impressive doctrine, and not one easy to understand fully. A little later he says, those who established the mystic rites for us were not inferior persons, but were speaking in riddles long ago, and they said that he who arrives there purified and initiated will dwell with the gods. Now, given all the points of comparison I just made between fairly deep themes in the Phaedo and Heraclitus, Plato may well have been thinking in these lines of Heraclitus. Heraclitus, who had long been famous for his obscure and riddling qualities. For whatever it's worth, I find a certain affinity between the overall literary philosophical character of the Phaedo, with its overlapping series of logical arguments and figurative stories, and the aphoristic quality of Heraclitus' fragments, because they provoke both logically and poetic. So much for the Heraclitean underground of the whole dialogue. My main concern here is Heraclitus' doctrine of the eternal logos and its relationship to theories of innate ideas in Plato's Phaedo. Our first clue that Heraclitus held the first notion of innate knowledge was that he proclaimed some grand logos that is present both in the human mind and in the world around it that it can know. Heraclitus said, this logos holds forever. All things happen in accordance with this logos. And he said, one could not discover the limits of soul. So deep a logos does it have. And he said, in the soul, there is a self-increasing logos. What I hope to show now is that Heraclitus also shares with Plato an important basic strategy for discovering the existence of innate knowledge. Recall the strategy in the Phaedo with the imperfectly equal slips and stones. Socrates observes that such physical things are never really equal because there's always at least some respect in which they are unequal. And yet, he argues, such things do put us in mind of perfect equality. As we use that concept anytime we judge that these physical things are perfectly equal. So we must somehow have knowledge of perfect equality prior to any such judgment about our experiences and their impact. That's the basic strategy for this point. The details are highly contested. That's the basic strategy for this experiment. In other words, experience stimulates the production of the concept of perfect equality, yet the content of the experience is too poor to provide the content of that concept. So the content of that concept must somehow be provided by the mind itself. Chomsky calls this strategy the argument from the property of the statements. He's developed it with much technical detail concerning knowledge of universal grammar, and he finds it generally successful in demonstrating the innateness of much of our basic conceptual framework. He also considers it a strategy devised by Plato to answer what he calls Plato's problem. Plato's problem of how we can come to know so much that is underdetermined by sense experience. But I believe that the real inauguration of this strategy occurs in Heraclitus. It isn't nearly so obvious in Heraclitus, as its elements are spread out among an incomplete corpus of aphoristic fragments. But if we allow for the fact that Heraclitus is writing more than a century before the Meno and the Phaedo, and with a deliberately provocative style in response to rather crude early versions of empirical inquiry, I think it's remarkable how well a poverty of the stimulus kind of interpretation fits the fragments that we make, once we decide to look for it. Consider the following. For one thing, Heraclitus claims that there is a special kind of wisdom consisting in knowledge of this grand logos. He says this logos is forever. All things happen in accordance with this logos. And what's wise is one thing, knowing the plan that steers through all things. He's identifying wisdom knowing this logos. Then for another thing, he argues that this special wisdom must make careful use of sense experience. He says, for instance, men who love wisdom should be inquirers into many things. And he says, I hold in higher esteem the things of which there is seeing and hearing and learning. And he says, in various ways, that most people don't know how to listen, just as they don't know how to speak. Special wisdom, it has to make use of sense experience, careful use of sense experience. And yet the content of this wisdom cannot be acquired from sense experience alone. He says, much learning does not teach understanding. He says, many do not understand the things they encounter, nor really recognize them when they have experienced them, though they think they do. called thinking the sacred disease, and he called sight deceptive. He said, nature loves to hide. So, special kind of knowledge consisting in the Logos. So to understand the Logos, we have to make careful use of sense experience, and yet the content of the Logos cannot be provided by the content of sense experience. So, this wisdom requires interpreting experience with a kind of understanding that is implicitly common to all human minds, though few ever consciously recognize it. He said, poor witnesses are eyes and ears for people who have barbarian souls and bodies, psychology. He says, that's why one must follow what is common. Though the Logos is common, and many live as though they had a private understanding. He also says famously that he inquired not only of experiences of the physical world, but he inquired of myself. He said, I inquired of myself. He says, the uncomprehending hear and are like the dead. The saying, absent while present, suits them. So now against that background, against that backdrop, let's consider the famous first fragment of Christ. If you wrote a book, this was probably the first time. Although this Logos exists forever, men prove uncomprehending before hearing and once heard. Although all things happen according to this Logos, they are like the unexperienced, experiencing such words and deeds as I explain, distinguishing each thing according to its nature and indicating how it is. Other men fail to notice what they do while they're awake, just as they forget what they do while they sleep. That's the end of the quotation. So if I'm interpreting part of the meaning of these fragments correctly, and if my comparison of Heraclitus' general approach with the Phaedo is roughly correct, then Heraclitus was the first to recognize Plato's problem. And Heraclitus began the attempt to solve it with the argument from the property of the stimulus. In other words, Heraclitus founded the tradition of epistemological atheism before Plato. And it seems that Heraclitus, rather than Plato, made that beginner's non-dispositional approach in terms of the innate actual content of the knowledge, rather than a specialized disposition to producing in the appropriate environment. Thanks.
All right, well, our next speaker is Professor Tammy Rashadko from the UU, and we're going to hear a paper from her on recollection and the Meno of Phaedo. So please join me in welcoming Professor Rashadko.
There should be a handout coming around. And I think there's enough. And there might even be enough to bring one up to Glenn here. I was thinking I had the original here. Just pull another out. The doctrine of recollection is mentioned explicitly by Plato in 3 of his dialogues, the Meno, the Phaedo, and the Phaedrus. In the Meno, it's introduced and defended as a means for resolving the paradox of inquiry. In the Phaedo, Plato first refers back to the Meno as the primary method for defending the doctrine of recollection, but then goes on to offer a second argument for it. Here, he uses it to demonstrate that each human soul existed before it was joined with the body at birth. In the Phaedrus, Plato assumes, but does not offer a defense of the doctrine, and rather than introducing it in order to solve a philosophical problem, he simply makes use of it in order to describe the soul's relationship to knowledge. What has come to be known as the paradox of inquiry is described explicitly at Meno AD. Having led Meno into aporia concerning the nature of virtue, Socrates confesses his own ignorance and says that he's hoping that, now that Meno and he agree that neither of them knows what virtue is, they might search for it together. Meno responds by asking Socrates how he will recognize virtue when he does meet up with it, if he doesn't know it to begin with. Socrates then articulates the paradox, and that's what you have as T1 on the handout. A man cannot search either for what he knows or for what he does not know. He cannot search for what he knows, since he knows it, there is no need to search, nor for what he does not know, since he does not know what to look for. Essentially, the paradox of inquiry breaks down into three claims, and you have these under B. Everything is either something I know or something I don't know. I can't inquire about what I already know, and I can't inquire about what I don't already know. Only the third claim is less than straightforward. Perhaps it's best explained by pointing out that if I try to find out about something I don't already know, then I won't be able to judge whether or not I have found out about it. If I don't already know what X is, I won't know when I'm learning about it or when I have learned about it. This formulation of the paradox of inquiry invites us to question the first claim above. Claim 1 treats knowledge as an all or nothing type of affair. The implication is that we either hit or miss the mark. We don't both hit it and miss it at the same time. Still, if one is to try to avoid the paradox of inquiry, the key would be to reject the first claim and to imagine that there is something in between knowing an object and not knowing an object. This is arguably the strategy Plato employs in developing the theory of recollection. It's the strategy that interpreters widely assume that he did adopt. I'm inclined to allow that Plato might use recollection in order to develop this sort of position in the Meno. There he claims that our having learned and then forgotten what we come to know in this life allows us to both know it in the sense of having it somewhere inside of us and not know it in the sense of not having it at all before our minds prior to sense experience when we first begin to recollect it. In this paper, I will show that Plato in the Phaedo more fully appreciates the position in which we are placed by the paradox of inquiry and aporia. Aporia, according to the Meno, is the state we are in when we first begin to recollect, a state in which we make progress in our inquiry only in the sense that we come to see that all of our beliefs about the object of our inquiry are false. That is, while he does not discuss aporia explicitly in the Phaedo, Plato recognizes in the Phaedo that inquiry must begin from a point of false belief and complete misunderstanding concerning one's intended object of inquiry. Yet if one is to have any chance of mounting a successful inquiry, one must be able to aim that inquiry at its object despite one's utter ignorance concerning it. Reference to that about which we inquire must be something with respect to which we are guaranteed to succeed. Thus, in the Phaedo, Plato can be seen to refine what he came up with in the Meno. The way to recover from the paradox of inquiry is not to find a position in which one both knows and does not know. What is necessary is that we be able to be infallible in our attempts to refer to that concerning which we are ignorant despite that very ignorance. We must be able to make incorrigible reference to our object of inquiry.
I will argue that a proper reading of the Phaedo argument shows Plato to allow that this small toehold on knowledge, the prerequisite for inquiry, is all that Plato finally thinks we gain through recollection. Another perhaps more instructive way to understand the paradox of inquiry is to generalize from all three of the places in the dialogues where it's indicated. This would include Theaetetus 146d through 147c and Euthyphro 6e, although it's not in those two places elucidated as fully as it is in Meno. In all three of these cases, the paradox follows a specific kind of interchange between Socrates and his interlocutor. Socrates has asked one of his famous "what is X" questions, and the interlocutor has responded with a list of things that are supposedly X. Socrates then points out that he was not looking for the list of things that are X, but rather what it is that all of these things have in common. To paraphrase, he says to each of his interlocutors, "Don't tell me what is on the list, tell me by what principle one decides for each thing one encounters, whether it belongs on the list or not." This question helps us to realize that one would have to already know the principle before one could decide which things belong on the list. Thus, our paradox can now be restated using three new claims, and you have these as D on your handout. For any X I choose, X is either on the list or is not on the list. I need to know the principle by which the list is put together before I can decide for each X I encounter whether or not X belongs on the list. I need to have a list that has already been put together according to the right principle if I am to succeed in abstracting the principle by looking at the list. In this version, the paradox is directly related to the formation of the principle in the list. One needs the principle before she can generate a list, but she needs a correct list before she can arrive at the principle. When we articulate the paradox in this way, we see that it arises from the assumption of empiricism. Empiricism dictates that we must start with a list that's not guaranteed to have been formulated on the basis of a principle. It is a list that we or one of our human teachers has constructed from things that seem like they belong on the list, but seem so in the absence of any knowledge on the part of the person constructing the list concerning how the list should be constructed. Now, I'm not going to read the next part of my paper. I'm just going to summarize two basic points that I make in it. One, and I think this is something that's relatively uncontroversial among all people who look at the theory of recollection. Whatever it is Plato thinks we get from recollection, both in the Meno and the Phaedo, he doesn't think that what happens is you do the demonstration with the slave boy, and now the slave boy knows the Pythagorean theorem. He doesn't think we look at sticks and stones and now we know what equality is. Recollection for Plato is a process, a long, slow, arduous process that begins with things like the slave boy argument and looking at sticks and stones and deciding whether they're equal or unequal. What I want to say, which I think is more controversial, although maybe not in this crowd, I'm guessing from the morning, is that Plato actually doesn't think we ever end up with knowledge in our mortal lives. It's not just that recollection takes a long time, it's that we never really get to that ultimate position of recovering whatever it was that we did know before we were born. The second thing I want to do is point out that Plato thinks that aporia is the first step in the process of recollection. And this, if you look at your handout at the bottom on page 2, here's what aporia consists in. If you look at T4, he says, of the slave boy, at first he did not know what the basic line of the 8-foot square was. Even now he does not yet know, but then he thought he knew and answered confidently as if he did know, and he did not think himself at a loss. But now he does think himself at a loss, as he does not know neither does he believe he knows. And actually Socrates goes on, pointing out how beneficial the slave boy's perplexity is to his finding out how things stand. Before, when he thought he knew, he would not have tried to find out. Now that he does, he realizes that he does not know, he's going to be motivated to investigate. So falling into perplexity and realizing that one does not know what the square or the equal or the beautiful or the good is the first step in recollecting. So the question I'm trying to answer in this paper is, if Plato doesn't think that what we get at the moment when we begin to recollect, right after aporia, when you do the demonstration with the slave boy, when you see equal sticks and stones, if he doesn't think that what we're getting is knowledge, what does he think that we're getting? What does he think we're getting? And why does he focus on that thing for us to get? How is that supposed to boot knowledge? How is that supposed to be the first step toward acquiring knowledge in your human life? Recognizing that we begin at this point of aporia where all we know is that we don't know. Where likely all of our beliefs that we now think are false. We think we have a complete misunderstanding of the thing about which we're about to inquire. Now I think it's probably incontrovertible that in the Meno, he thinks at the end of the slave boy argument that the slave boy ends up with true belief. Maybe he thinks that's the first step to acquiring knowledge. What I want to argue is that in the Phaedo, that's not what Socrates thinks the first step is, or what Plato thinks the first step is. He thinks there's at least one step that happens before true belief, if we even get as far as true belief, and that what we're getting out of recollection is something much more modest than true belief, but also much more important than true belief, and it has to do with having the ability to refer to something about which we're completely ignorant and actually succeed in referring to that thing. So now I'll read somewhere. So it's clear that Plato does not see recollection as resulting in immediate full-blown knowledge in either the Meno or the Phaedo. In both dialogues, Plato sees recollection as a process that has a beginning in our perceptual experiences, but for mortals, no end. In the Phaedo, recollection does not give us knowledge of the equal, the beautiful, and the good. Does it give us true beliefs about them? Socrates does nothing to indicate that it does. What is indicated in the Phaedo is that recollection does something more modest, more subtle, and more important than give us true beliefs. It does something to jumpstart the process of coming to know. What jumpstart does Plato think that our attainment of knowledge in a previous disembodied life gives us in this life? How does this actually take place? It's easy to show that Plato thinks recollection is the first step to coming to know anything in our mortal life. What exactly the beginning of the process of recollection is supposed to give us is a much harder question to answer. This is the question I'll try to answer now. It's alluded to in the Meno, but it's answered in the Phaedo. I will proceed by trying to say more precisely what the initial problem and paradox must be, and then what sort of revelation needs to occur in order for us to begin to recollect. I'll then go on to demonstrate that this revelation is exactly what we are shown to bring to our understanding of sticks and stones in the Phaedo. It's my contention that in the Phaedo, Plato is focused on the resolution of a further paradox that he understood lurked within the paradox of inquiry. A paradox, the resolution of which is a prerequisite for resolving the paradox of inquiry, but is at the same time no magic bullet. It does not allow us to know that which we seek. In our discussion of the Meno passage, or if you had heard my discussion of it, we noted that Socrates regarded aporia, the recognition that one does not know what one earlier took himself to know, as the first step in recollection. What does it take to realize that one does not know something like the square or the equal? What kind of relationship do we need to have with the equal before we can realize our ignorance concerning it? If we do not know the equal, how do we know that it is the equal of which we are ignorant? If we do not know the equal, how will we know what we are recollecting when we begin to recollect it? How will we know that we are, for example, recollecting the equal rather than the unequal? Augustine begins the second paragraph of his Confessions by saying this: "Grant me, Lord, to know and understand. Which comes first, to call upon you or to praise you? And calling upon you is an act of believing in you. But who calls upon you when he does not know you? For an ignorant person might call upon someone else instead of the right one. But surely you may be called upon in prayer that you may be known. Yet how shall they call upon him in whom they have not believed? And how shall they believe without a preacher?" Realizing he does not know the Lord, and believing that praying to the Lord is the appropriate vehicle to coming to know him, Augustine begins to pray, only to realize that he's caught in a paradox. How can I seek the Lord through prayer if I don't already know him? For how will I be sure to address my prayers to the right addressee? One could think of this as an instance of a paradox that is analogous to the paradox of inquiry. I need to pray to the Lord in order to come to know him, but if I don't already know him, how can I be sure that I'm addressing my prayers to God and not to some other being whom I have mistaken for him? But the notion that I might have mistaken God for some other being to whom I have accidentally addressed my prayers shows our paradox to be not one of knowledge or recognition, as is the paradox of inquiry. We have here a paradox of address, a paradox of reference to that of which we are ignorant. Even if the Lord is somewhere out there to be addressed, if there are a number of other beings out there as well, and I don't know any of them, when I try to pick out the Lord and try to get to know him, how can I be sure that I've picked out the right one? I have to think about the Lord before I can come to know him, before I have any beliefs, true or false, about him. How can I be sure I'm thinking about and thus trying to get to know the right thing? That recollection begins with aporia, with the realization that one doesn't know the thing that one wishes to think about in order to investigate, forces this paradox of reference to haunt Plato as well. If I'm ignorant of a property and am to be led to recollect it through physical examples that refer to this property of which I'm ignorant, how am I to know which of my innate ideas that property is bringing me to recall? In order to see that Plato is beholden to, appreciates, and tries to overcome this paradox, let us look carefully at the sticks and stones argument for recollection in the Phaedo. And now we'll go back to the handout. I'll talk through this part. Glenn in his paper said, and that's kind of how the sticks and stones argument goes. There's a lot of debate about it, and I'm going to try to summarize that debate really, really quickly. So if you look at page 3 in your handout. So here's basically the argument from the text. It's a very short argument, 2 premises and 1 conclusion. It's text 8, T8 on your handout. Don't equal sticks and stones, the same ones, sometimes appear to one, and then most of us supply man there equal to another not. There's some debate about that. Some people think there's nothing in the Greek asks you to supply something, and you kind of have to figure out what you want to supply based on how you think the argument is best interpreted. Some people would supply stick there instead. There's some argument that grammatically it's not quite as good to supply stick, and there's a lot more agreement, I'd say, on the man rather than the stick. So that's the first premise. What then? Have the equals themselves ever appeared unequal to you, or equality ever appeared to be inequality? Therefore, says, "Oh, never Socrates." Therefore, they are not the same thing, Socrates said, the equals and the equal itself. There's a lot more we could say about this in terms of weirdnesses in the Greek here, but we won't. So basically, the way this argument is interpreted is that it's a non-identity of discernibles. What we have is we have a premise about sticks and stones and a premise about equality itself, and what we're doing, or what Socrates is doing in the dialogue, is attributing a property to one and not the other, and saying, therefore, they're not the same thing. Let me leave aside how that's supposed to show that we recollect the equality, because that's less important to my argument. That would take longer. So, the most common way, so the question becomes, it's a non-identity of discernibles. That means there's some property we're attributing to one thing to equal sticks and stones and not equality itself, or the other way around. What is the property? And very, very great majority of interpreters say that the property is perfection. That what we're saying is something like what we have under H, that equal sticks and stones are imperfectly equal, whereas equality itself is perfectly equal. Therefore, equality itself must be something other than equal sticks and stones. Now, even the people who interpret the argument this way break into two camps. I'll call one the traditional interpretation, and that's pretty much the claim that what we're talking about when we say equality itself is perfectly equal is something like mathematical equality. The kind of equality that only, for example, 1 plus 1 can have with 2, not a kind of equality that exists in the physical world. Therefore, physical things are never really equal with each other. They're never perfectly equal. The second one is one that I think is most closely associated with Gregory Vlastos, became popular after he wrote his Degrees of Reality article. And that is this notion of a super object, or let's just say super object. This is the idea that equality itself, what it means to say that it's perfectly equal, is that it's equal in all respects, always and everywhere, right? So equal sticks and stones will be equal today, but not tomorrow. They'll be equal in length, but not in thickness or not in color. Equality itself doesn't have any qualifications to its equality. It's unqualifiedly equal. Now, there's a third interpretation, though, that takes a whole different property to be the one in question, and that's what you have under I. Here, the property is that we have incorrigible beliefs about equality itself. I think I wrote this wrong. We have incorrigible beliefs about equality itself and not about equal sticks and stones. Let me clarify it by demonstrating how it works in the argument. The first premise would be interpreted that, I can be wrong in the belief that these two sticks before me are equal, for they might actually be unequal. So someone can present me with two sticks. I can think they're equal, and it can turn out that the sticks are actually unequal, so I can be wrong about equal sticks and stones. I can't be wrong that equality is equality and not inequality. It's never the case that I try to think about or refer to equality and accidentally think about or refer to inequality. Therefore, equality itself must be something other than equal sticks and stones. Thus, the property that equality itself has that differentiates it from equal sticks and stones is that we have incorrigible beliefs about equality itself. For example, we believe incorrigibly that equality is not the same thing as inequality. If we didn't believe that, nobody would be able to succumb to the Phaedo argument. You'd never convince anybody with it if they didn't already believe that equality and inequality were two different things. So we have incorrigible beliefs about that, but not about equal sticks and stones. Okay. So now, I haven't lost my place. So now let's talk about how this paradox itself out in the Phaedo itself. So what the Sticks and Stones passage does is put us in contact with an epistemological paradox in the Phaedo, and again, recollection is designed to relieve us of that paradox. But this time, the paradox does not fall neatly along the lines raised by the paradox of inquiry, as described in the Meno. In the Meno, I was supposed to compose a finite list of things with a certain property, like equality. The problem was that before I could begin to compose the list, I had to know the principle by which it was to be put together. But I had no access to the principle apart from whatever I chose to put on the list. I only had access to those things that were candidates for the list. I needed the principle in order to make the list, and I needed a list that had been composed correctly before I could abstract the principle. The solution was to break through the wall of empiricism and have it turn out that I already had potential access to the principle, a potentiality that became actualized when I came in contact with a finite number of appropriate candidates for the list. But this time it looks like a different aspect of empiricism is the problem. Assuming the conclusion of the recollection argument from the Meno, I have at least potential access to two kinds of things. A collection of principles on the one side, which I have in me because I got them before I was born, and a collection of sense experiences on the other, which I get through my senses. I have access to these principles, but I'm ignorant of them. I must investigate them by investigating the sense experiences which refer me to them by falling short of them. Even once the problem of access is overcome, even if I have access to those principles, there's an additional problem, a matching problem. When I see sticks and stones, how do I know to which of the principles I'm being referred, so that I know that by investigating physical sticks and stones, I'm embarking upon an investigation of that principle? For recall that recollection begins at the operatic moment, the moment at which I realize only that this thing that I took myself to know is something of which I'm totally ignorant. I need to investigate sticks and stones in order to recollect equality. But if I'm ignorant of equality, how can I know that it's equality that sticks and stones will help me to investigate? This paradox of reference to that of which I'm ignorant that lies within the paradox of inquiry might be put as follows. This is J on your handout. I have every principle by which to list my sense experiences within me, and I also have many sense experiences. I have no reliably true beliefs about the principles. Every sense experience falls short of every principle that it exemplifies. I need to match the sense experiences with the appropriate principles. What we have here is still a problem with empiricism, but the empirical problem is this. My sense experience alone cannot guarantee that it is getting me to think about the principle that I take myself to be thinking about. Whatever property I abstract from equal sticks and stones, the equal sticks and stones all by themselves can't indicate to me that what I'm abstracting is equality rather than inequality. I need a guarantee that the property that I take myself to be thinking about and therefore investigating is indeed the property that I am thinking about. And I need to get it from something other than sense experience. Augustine worries about accidentally addressing his prayers to the wrong being in the absence of knowledge of God that is to be gained only through prayer. This is not the core of Augustine's problem. Even if there were no other beings, he would still need to have some idea that God was out there before he could pray to him. But the idea that there might be an additional being does complicate Augustine's project. He can't just send his prayers out there assuming they will either be received or returned to him labeled return to sender, address unknown. For they could also land at the door of the wrong being if they are sent without an address that distinguishes that addressee from his neighbors. And that is a seemingly insurmountable problem when one can know nothing about the addressee before one sends the letter. Likewise, in the Phaedo, even if equality were my only innate idea, It's not clear that I could discover it without first knowing that it was there in me somewhere to be discovered. But my project is further complicated by the fact that I have many other principles in me as well. To make matters worse, our various interpretations of the Phaedo passage make it clear that none of our sense experiences are foolproof examples of any one of these principles to the exclusion of the others. Let's go back to what Plato thinks the perceptual objects to which we do have access and which cause us to recollect are like. On one reading of the Phaedo, they don't even have the property that they are presumed to cause us to recollect. We might call some sticks and stones equal, but they aren't really equal. That's the mathematical perfection one. On another reading of the Phaedo, they are both equal and unequal at the same time. They're equally good representations of both properties. On a third reading of the Phaedo, they are confusing examples of equality. Examples that easily lead me to be wrong when I attribute equality to the objects of my sense experience. Plato needs me to be able to fix my thoughts upon true equality even while looking at what are at best misleading examples of it, or at worst, examples that divulge false information. I need to be able to think about equality and differentiate it from inequality and every other property in the absence of any beliefs about it at all. And once I overcome that hurdle, entering aporia, in the absence of true beliefs. I need to be able to be sure that I am thinking about equality, even if it is as a result of looking at unequal sticks and stones and believing them falsely to be equal. I need a guarantee that, even in that case, it is equality and not inequality upon which I have fixed my thoughts and my investigation. Plato wants to assume that I don't have to already know, i.e. be able to give an account of equality itself before I can know that I'm referring to it. I need to be able to know that my reference succeeds without having to know equality itself. That is what recollection needs to give me, so that I can begin the investigation that ideally ends in knowledge, although for a human will only get very close to knowledge. Earlier, I characterized the Phaedo argument as a non-identity of discernibles. Premise 1 states that equal sticks and stones lack a certain property. Premise 2 attributed the same property to equality itself. Thus, the conclusion was that equal sticks and stones and equality itself are not identical. The three interpretations of the argument that I presented differed concerning what particular property was being attributed to equality itself and not to particular sticks and stones. In the first two, the property was some kind of perfection. The difference was that, while equal sticks and stones were only imperfectly equal, equality itself was perfectly equal. Now I'm going to talk through the handout for another minute. I think it doesn't matter which of the interpretations you choose of the Phaedo in order to see what the problem is. I think you see that we have a problem about reference to that of which we're ignorant. No